Hi. This lecture is going to be about this book called Discounting the Future by Liliana Durganova. It's an exceptional book and one that I highly recommend, although I must admit some of the math did challenge me. But you can kind of skim past that and just focus on the argument. Um, the title of the book is Discounting the Future, and it's a concept that I think is particularly interesting and important for the way we think about now, because what Berganova tries to show is the ways by which government, but also industry, calculate whether or not something is worth doing in the present. And so, if you think about climate change as something that we think is happening right now, but its effects will only really be felt into the future, it requires that we act now in order to change the future. And so it's worth thinking about what are the kinds of things that affect people's, particularly governments' ways of thinking about how to make that decision. So I think it would be fair to say there's never been a time when action to avert or mitigate climate change was needed more than it is right now, and yet the global response to it continues to be sluggish at best. Even when it is acknowledged that action is necessary, the time frame for that action is widely disputed, and in general, it's postponed. Um, which should prompt the question, what factors determine whether or not action is taken today or later? And one obvious factor is, of course, cost, or more particularly, cost versus benefit. So another way of putting this question would be to ask, how do governments, for example, put a price on the future? Now, this question is more complicated than it seems because price and value are not fixed. Something that is very valuable today may not be so valuable in the future. And likewise, something that is cheap today may become very expensive in the future. If you buy a new car today, it will be worth less than what you paid for it within a couple of years. And this seems okay to us because we get use value out of it in the meantime. By contrast, if you buy a house today, then it is conceivable, depending on where it is, that it will in fact be worth more than what you paid for it in a few years. Which in a way makes no sense because the house is now more used than it was in the same way that a car was. And we may calculate that even though it was more expensive to buy than to rent, it was still worth it because of this gain in capital. And government make similar kinds of calculations. So the question these two examples raise are as follows. Is the future worth more or less than the present? Is the future all that matters? I.e., should we think about the future to the exclusion of the present or give it priority over the present? And is the value or price of something the best or indeed a reasonable way to think about the future? The reason these questions are important is this is how government decides whether it will act on an issue or not. This means it will not act in situations where the economic cost in the present outweighs the economic return in the future. And climate change is one such issue. The cost of changing everything, as Naomi Klein puts it, will be astronomical. And the financial return is uncertain and very probably won't match it. Therefore, in financial terms, it could be considered irrational to act. And certainly that's a major reason why governments are hesitating. So the way by which these calculations are arrived at then becomes super important. It's not just mathematics, it is politics. And the key to it all is the idea that money spent today is intrinsically more valuable than money we might have tomorrow. Now, as I warned at the start, the math on this can get pretty complicated, but we only really need to grasp the basic premise, which can be explained relatively simply. So, for example, if you have $100 and that can buy 40 litres of milk today, then we can use the cost of milk as a constant. If $100 10 years from now only buys 20 liters of milk, then we can say $100 today is worth twice as much as $100 in a decade. If 100 years from now, $100 does not even buy 1 liter of milk, then we can say that $100 today is worth 100 times more, in fact, many more times, than it will be in a century. If you think about this in investment terms, its importance becomes clearer. If I invest $100 today and it is still only worth $100 10 years from now, I have effectively lost money. If I invest $100 today and 10 years from now it's only worth $200, I may well have still lost money because $100 in the future will be worth half of what it is today. So in order to not lose money, I need to do better than doubling my money in 10 years. Now, these are just made up numbers to illustrate a point and should not be taken as financial advice. Investors and government use these types of considerations to calculate return on investment over time. And the difference between money today and money 10 years from now is calculated according to a formula known as discounting or real present value. We apply this in everyday life all the time, even if we don't know the exact formulas. And so, for example, you could think about the COVID lockdowns that we had a few years ago in these terms. Give up your mobility today so as to be free to move in the future when the virus is treatable, and that was essentially the calculation. Lockdown protesters took the view that their mobility today was more valuable than their future mobility because if they didn't work today, then in a sense they didn't have a future. And the lockdowns were eventually lifted for economic rather than health reasons. In other words, the present was given greater value than the future. And this is the phenomenon we're trying to understand, how the future is devalued or discounted. Uber's surge pricing follows this model too. Pay extra to get home right now, or wait an indefinite period of time and pay less. So it puts a premium on the right now, thereby literally discounting the future. Ticketmaster uses a similar strategy for its concert tickets. Pay more now to advance in the queue, or wait a bit and pay less. Again, the future is discounted. In other words, these pricing strategies ask you to place a value on your time. How you calculate that doesn't really matter. You might calculate it on the basis of lost earnings because you could be working instead of waiting, or you could count it existentially. Governments decide to undertake some kind of life-saving legislation, such as banning asbestos, do so by placing a nominal value on the lives being saved. Now, this is not calculated according to how much we all love Aunt Betty, for instance. Rather, it is calculated according to Aunt Betty's potential life earnings. Depending on what you use as your constants, this would be around $2 million, which is about the amount that governments place as the value of people. So discounting serves a legitimate purpose in a sense. It helps to determine the fair price of an asset, and it is useful deciding which investments offer the best value. What is in question, though, is when and how it is used. In the simplest of terms, is this the best way to think about the future? In other words, discounting isn't just something that accounts and finance types do. It serves a social and cultural purpose that we should investigate. Now, Durganova proposes to understand discounting in terms of the concept of performativity, taken from the British philosopher J.L. Austin, who, as a complete side note, had an absolutely fascinating undercover career during World War II, and I highly recommend his biography as a sort of diverting read. Anyway, Austin was interested in the fact that certain phrases are actually actions that, or to put it another way, that the saying of the phrase actually causes the action to take place. And the classic example of this is, I pronounce you husband and wife, wife and so on. The very saying of that phrase, the pronunciation of it, actually performs the action. And as Durganova explains, performative statements, unlike constatives, so a constative is a statement that says the book is on the table, for example, performatives cannot be falsified. So someone is or is not married by the statement, I marry you, but true or false doesn't come into it. So performatives are thought in terms of success and failure, not true and false. And this is determined by what Austin called felicity conditions. Namely, is somebody suitably qualified and empowered to pronounce someone a husband and wife, or wife and wife, and so on. If they are, the marriage will succeed. It is a marriage. If they're not qualified, then the marriage is null and void. So performatives, in a sense, intervene into the world that they are uttered in, and they literally change the world. They cause the world to change. The difference between a constative and a performative then is between the intensity with which varies when we apply it to financial statements. So if one says the value of capital today is derived from the value of future income, then as a constative, we can say whether that is true or false. But as a performative, it is now a matter of whether that works or not, or rather, is it a matter of determining under which conditions it might work? In other words, what are the felicity conditions that we need to attach to this statement? And the basic answer to this question is that the world must be receptive to the idea of discounting, i.e., ready to price the present in terms of the future. And Berganova's argument is that once the idea of discounting was floated, it changed the world. Once financial people started to think in terms of discounting, the very idea of value itself changed. The world began to resemble what the concept had in fact hypothesized. So discounting is performative in the sense that when people use it to decide what to invest in, the calculation brings that investment into being. So discounting is thus a theory of action. And as Dogonova suggests, it can be regarded as a form of political technology. So he says it has four political qualities. It determines the value of assets, it allocates resources, it governs behaviors, and most importantly, it acts on the future. So making things valuable, discounting makes things valuable, but does so in a peculiar way. First, it ignores past value, so what something costs to produce is of no relevance. Likewise, what someone might pay for it in the future is no relevance. All that matters is what income it will produce. So failure to take the future into account is political. If you do not build footpaths along the roads, then you are basically consigning people to walk on the roads or to not walk at all. And if you think about this in a suburb surrounding a school, the impact of this decision is obviously profound. If you design roads that are so narrow there is no room for a bike, then you are actively discouraging cycling. And the future is thus baked into the design as being for cars only, and walking and cycling is effectively valued at zero. We can also say these decisions say who is granted a capacity to act and who isn't. If you don't have access to a car, then your mobility needs have not been recognized or accommodated. They haven't been valued. And this amounts to a form of forced immobilization. Here we slide into the second political technique, namely the allocation of resources. The assumption is always that resources will be allocated according to that which would yield maximum present value. Do we spend millions developing treatments for rare diseases or focus only on the most common diseases? If we develop drugs for rare diseases, should they be more expensive? So discounting is used to arrive at the so-called true price. Or more specifically, discounting presumes that pricing is itself a kind of truth. The price arrived at by the market, i.e., what the market will bear, is said to be a just price, where that means the producer has been properly compensated for their investment. But we should ask, can we really define justice in this way? And for instance, when you're thinking about healthcare, is price the correct way to think about whether or not you can improve somebody's life, whether you can enable them to live or die? Is price the only factor that we should be thinking about? And this leads to the third technology of government relating to discounting, shaping behavior. In particular, it shapes the behavior of government, which uses it as a measure for assessing how it should govern. In economics, price and value is always seen as influencing and shaping behavior. Hence the endless debate about taxes, what should be taxed, what shouldn't be taxed, how much tax should be, and so on. Tax are always seen as both revenue raising and also as levers for influencing behavior. It is assumed that people will always seek to maximize value. And it also assumes that value can always be measured in financial terms. But measuring everything in financial terms is the reason discounting acts on the future, which is its fourth political technology. And this can be thought about in terms of the question, which was the origin for discounting, namely, when is it the right time to chop down a tree from the perspective of a timber industry? So when the colonialists arrived in Australia, they clear-felled millions of hectares of forest, often just simply burning the timber in place in order to create farmland. And sadly, this continues today. Likewise, land is cleared for housing estates, and again, the trees are often simply burned in place. In other words, it is calculated that the land is more valuable today without trees on them than they would be in the future with trees on them. Or to put it in another way, the trees only have value insofar as they are chopped down, which is a kind of standard refrain for trying to understand forestry, and also the absolutely baffling state of inaction with respect to climate change. Anyway, it's a very short introduction. I highly recommend this book. Don't be put off by the math, but do read it and do think about what it means to discount the future.